Bonjour and welcome back to the US History course. This is your professor, Philippe Girard. In this section, we're covering US foreign policy around 1900, which was a key period when the US, after growing its economy during the Gilded Age, began throwing its weight around the world. In a previous lecture, we focused on the first area that felt the weight of US influence, which is to say Latin America and the Caribbean. Things like, the US intervention in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, 1898, or the US involvement in Panama in 1903 to obtain a canal zone. And there were dozens of interventions like those in the Caribbean. All of them were motivated in part by one, national security, meaning promoting the US Navy. Number two, greed, securing raw materials and captive markets overseas. And number three, idealism, spreading the US democratic model overseas. Today, we're going to change continents altogether and move to Europe during World War I. The main motives, however, will remain the same: national security, economic interests, and idealism. But the scale of the conflict will change. We're no longer dealing with small colonial conflicts, but with a major world war fought all the way from the Marianas in the Pacific to Tanzania in Africa and Armenia in the Middle East. Because this is a US history course, our main focus will be on Western Europe, which is where US troops fought for the most part. But if you're interested, I taped a few other videos on World War I for my world history course. And there's a video on the outbreak of the war in Western Europe. There's one on the Russian Revolution in 1917, and another one on the war record of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. So check those out if you're interested. But anyway, let's start with the obvious question for us. How did the whole shebang begin? Why is it that halfway through the beautiful summer of 1914, a bunch of European countries suddenly decided, let's butcher each other for the next 4 years? When I ask that question in class, the typical answer I get from students is, well, professor, it's the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And that murder did play a role, but there were a few other more long-term factors that we need to look at first. Wars are often fought over territory, and that war was no exception. France and Germany had a long-running dispute over the province of Alsace, which sits smack on their border. Another province in dispute would be Bosnia in the Balkans, and that belonged to a large empire known as Austria-Hungary, but a nearby kingdom called Serbia wanted it as well, so another source of conflict. The main concern for Great Britain was not territorial, it was naval. As an island, the UK relied on its navy to protect itself, to trade with others, to secure its sea lanes to its colonial empire. So Britain insisted on having not just the largest navy in the world, but a navy twice as large as the second largest navy in the world. And by navy, I mean dreadnoughts. These were large, heavily armored battleships, and these were the main naval units at the time. We're in an era before aircraft carriers and after wooden sailing ships. So all of that was well and good until the Emperor of Germany, the Kaiser, decided that he wanted to build a big fleet of dreadnoughts of his own, and that led to a bitter naval arms race with England. So if Germany built 5 dreadnoughts, then England would build 10 to maintain its 2-to-1 superiority, and then Germany would build 10 dreadnoughts, and then England had to build 20. And so the relationship between the two countries quickly degenerated as a result of the naval arms race. More generally, Europe in 1914 was very jingoistic, and jingoism is simply an extreme form of patriotism. Patriotism means loving your country, which is a good thing, while jingoism means loving your country to the point of hating others, which is not a good thing. And well, Europeans in 1914, they were over the top nationalistic, so they were all too willing to fight and possibly die for their country, which is what happened. And so because of this mindset, many countries began looking for allies before a war even broke out. Germany signed an agreement known as the Triple Alliance with 2 other countries, Austria-Hungary and Italy. And if one of these 3 countries was attacked, the other 2 would join in. In response, the main rival of Germany, which would be France, negotiated the Triple Entente with Britain and Russia. And that was dangerous because if a conflict ever broke out between just 2 countries like France and Germany, then this conflict would quickly escalate to a major world war involving all 6 great powers of Europe and their colonies overseas. And that's exactly what happened in 1914. So it's now time to move away from the long term causes of the war and analyze the proximate short term causes. And that's when the assassination of Franz Ferdinand comes in. He was the heir to the throne of Austria Hungary, and in 1914, he and his wife were visiting Sarajevo when they were shot dead by a group of assassins, who, as it happened, came from nearby Serbia, the very same country that already had a long running dispute with Austria Hungary over Bosnia. And that was a major deal. Just think for a second what would happen if the heir to the throne in this country, and that would be the vice president, I guess, was shot by assassins sent by Mexico, because Mexico was hoping to get Texas back from the US or something. That could very well lead to a war between the US and Mexico. Well, that's exactly what happened in 1914. Austria Hungary declared war on Serbia. And because of all the alliances that I mentioned earlier, other countries jumped in as well. I'll spare you the details, but by August 1914, just about every major power in Europe had declared war on each other. On one side, you had Germany and Austria Hungary, and they were also joined by the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey today. And these are the countries in green in the middle of the map. They're also known as the Central Powers. On the other side was Russia, France, and Britain. That's the Triple Entente, also known as the Allies. And Italy later joined them too. And these would be the countries in yellow on the map. And the countries in gray would be the smart ones, those that remained neutral and avoided the bloodshed altogether. And the US at that point remained neutral. All right, now that we've looked at the origins of the war, let's take a look at the fighting. Again, we're early in the war, so that's before the US joined in. The last major war in Europe that dated back to the Napoleonic era, when groups of men would march together in formation against volleys of muskets. Casualty rates were fairly low back then, and offensive tactics were the most effective. Just run across the battlefield. Everyone expected that the next war in the 20th century would be similar to the past one in the 19th century, so they entered World War I thinking that they could win a quick and decisive victory with minimal casualties. Well, wars don't always unfold as planned. Remember when George Bush invaded Iraq in 2003 and he expected a repeat of the first Gulf War fought by his father? Well, that war turned out to be a quagmire, not a cakewalk. Same thing with World War I. The war did not last weeks as expected, but years. And the death toll was not in the thousands as expected, but in the millions. And the main reason was a change in weaponry. Modern repeating rifles had replaced the muskets of the Napoleonic era. Machine guns were now a thing, so were exploding artillery shells. So soldiers would march across an open field, banners unfurled, and then they would be mowed down by enemy fire. So by the winter of 1914, soldiers began to dig in to protect themselves from enemy fire. And instead of a war of movement, World War I became a quagmire, a stalemate, trench warfare. As seen in this aerial picture, people on each side dug trenches, and these are the squiggly lines on the picture. And the area in the middle between the two lines of trenches would be called no man's land, a half mile or so of lunar terrain, bombed over and over again, devoid of trees, vegetation, pock-marked by craters, and littered with the dead and the dying. No man's land. West of Germany, there was a continuous line of trenches from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and that was called the Western Front with Belgium and France, and that's where the US troops eventually fought. East of Germany, facing Russia, was, well, the Eastern Front, east of Germany. And still, even though the casualty rates were so high, people were patriots who hoped to win the damn thing. So they attacked anyway. They'd go over the top, was the expression, into no man's land, run for half a mile or so across open terrain, navigate through the craters and the barbed wire, all the while being shot at by machine gun nests. And if by some miracle they took the enemy trench in front of them, well, the enemy would fall back to the support trench behind, and you'd have to do it all over again to capture the next trench, and then the next support trench. It was almost impossible to break through. In this context, battles were long and bloody affairs. The most famous battle of the Western Front both took place in 1916. That year, the British tried to break through in the Somme area, while the Germans launched a battle of attrition around the French city of Verdun. Those battles lasted for months. They caused hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. including a great grandfather of mine. I knew him when I was a kid. He had lost an eye at the Battle of the Somme. And then when those battles ended, the front line had barely moved by a few miles. And that's World War One for you. If you're interested in World War One, by the way, I recommend watching Path of Glory, which is by the US director Stanley Kubrick. That one is set in France in 1916. Another great movie would be All Quiet on the Western Front, which is set on the German side of the Western Front. And another great movie would be the French movie Joyeux Noël, which is set during the first Christmas of the war. But back to the narrative. Let's talk about the home front. Contrary to World War II, civilians in World War I were largely shielded from the war, which was limited to the trenches. But those civilians would be indirectly impacted in other ways because the war was long, it was costly, and armies used millions of artillery shells and guns and airplanes and eventually tanks. So all of that had to be produced. And so World War I was as much an economic war as an actual fighting war on the front line. This is what historians call total war, when your entire society, civilians included, is mobilized for the war effort, when war is not just about battlefield tactics, but also economic warfare. So how did civilians on the home front contribute in World War I? Well, they paid higher taxes to pay for the war effort, and that was not enough, so they also put all their savings into buying war bonds. And then they also endured rationing because economies could not produce enough for the war effort and the civilian market, so civilians had to do without gasoline or meat, especially in Russia and Germany, because everything went to the army on the front line. This was definitely not what people had been promised at the outset of the war, because they had been told the war would be cheap and painless. And so governments during the war had to convince their citizens that the war was worth fighting for in the first place. So total war also meant propaganda, a public campaign by the government to mobilize public opinion. So, for example, posters would encourage people to buy war bonds, or posters would depict the German soldiers as barbarians who had invaded neutral Belgium and were killing all the little babies there. Propaganda. And when I speak of the home front, I mostly mean women. When the young men were mobilized and sent to the front, women had to take over back in the rear. They had to drive tractors on the farm, they had to operate industrial machinery on the factory floor, and there was such a shortage of everything, including laborers, that women had to pick up the slack and produce the stuff. And that was a big change from the Victorian model of womanhood, when upper class women wore impossible outfits because they didn't do manual labor. And that's a shift to a more modern 20th century vision of womanhood, where women also have a career. So as a result, in World War I, women started to cut their hair short and they wore pants because that was more practical on the factory floor. And that later led in the 1920s to the fashion of Coco Chanel in France, or the flapper movement in the US. Women also worked in more traditionally male jobs like blue collar jobs, and now they expected to be taken seriously as citizens because they contributed as much as men. And as a result, women obtained the right to vote in many countries after World War I, like in the UK, in Turkey, and also the US. That would be the 19th Amendment in 1920. So World War I was a horrible conflict overall, but it did have one positive impact: greater gender equality. Because fighting on land was going on nowhere, armies moved into another dimension, the air, third dimension. The first flight of the Wright brothers was very recent, 1903, so we're still talking rudimentary airplanes made of wood and fabric, or dirigibles, which were known in Germany as zeppelins. And these planes and these dirigibles were useful for scouting and bombing to some extent, so command of the air was a major goal. And aerial combat also became a thing, what's known as dogfights. So maybe let's take another detour to cinema, because there are several great movies about air combat in World War I. I would recommend Hell's Angels, which was shot shortly after the war with actual World War I airplanes. And I also recommend Flyboys, which is more recent, but also a good flick to watch. And I also mentioned the old French movie La Grande Illusion, which is technically about World War I pilots also. Great movie too. As it turned out, no country gained air superiority in World War I, so air combat became just another way to kill young people without gaining significant strategic advantage. So what about the sea then? When the war began, England expected to fight a major battle with Germany at sea using their grand fleet of dreadnoughts. England would win, as usual, and the war would be won in a day. And as always, the war did not unfold as planned. For the most part, the German high seas fleet remained at home, the big exception being the Battle of Jutland, which was kind of a draw, and so there was no quick, decisive victory at sea. England remained in control of the seas by default, so they established a naval blockade, meaning that they prevented ships from reaching Germany, the way you'd besiege a medieval castle, and the goal there was to slowly starve Germany. And that worked. By 1918, Germany was suffering major shortages of everything. And meanwhile, France and Britain could import all the goods they wanted from neutral powers like the US because they controlled the seas. But all that was a slow process. So in response, Germany figured, let's try another dimension, under the sea, unter the, i.e. U-boats or submarines. And Germany built hundreds of those, the goal being to sneak under the British surface fleet and attack anyone approaching British shores. On paper, this was a great strategy because England was very reliant on imported food and raw materials. It's an island. The main issue was diplomacy. Warfare at sea was regulated by strict laws as of War I. You could attack enemy ships in wartime, obviously, but when attacking civilian merchant ships, especially those from neutral countries, there were rules to follow. You had to stop the ship first, announce your intentions, inspect the cargo, leave sailors enough time to leave the ship, and only then could you sink the ship. But submarines are fragile vessels. They rely on stealth and surprise to survive. So in practice, German submarines attacked without warning, even if that meant killing civilians. Germany practiced unrestricted submarine warfare. They would sink any ship, civilian or not, neutral or not, as long as they got anywhere near Britain. Again, a very effective strategy, economically speaking, but with a big downside. It risked angering neutral countries like the US. And that's exactly what happened in 1915 when the Lusitania, which was a British ocean liner like the Titanic, got sunk by a German submarine on its way from the US to the UK. 1,200 civilians were killed in the sinking, including 128 US citizens, and the US was so outraged that the US almost entered World War I as a result. Germany then announced that it would halt unrestricted submarine warfare, and so the US backed off. Well, for now. We'll get back to it in a second. So that was the situation as of 1916. A major war in Europe that was costly and indecisive while the US remained neutral. Well, almost. The US did sell weapons to the UK and France, but it did not sell weapons to Germany because of the British naval blockade. So in practice, the US was playing favorites. Well, now might be the time to shift our focus to the US itself. After all, this is a US history course. So first question, why would America enter World War I? Yeah, that's a difficult question, actually. We saw that European countries began the war because of disputes over Alsace or Bosnia that in no way involved the US. Also, Europeans stumbled into the war, not understanding how awful it would be. By contrast, the US entered World War I knowing full well that it would be no walk in the park. Also, there was a long-standing US tradition not to get involved in European disputes. That tradition went back all the way to George Washington, our first president, who had famously warned Americans not to get, quote, entangled in European affairs. That was called the non-entanglement policy. So in the 19th century, the US were very willing to expand in North America by fighting wars with Mexico or Native Americans. We also talked about the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and how the US was eager to act as the policeman of Latin America. But as a rule, the US did not fight in Europe, only the Americas. And it wasn't even clear on which side the US should fight if it did enter World War I. As of 1916, a lot of Americans were recent immigrants from Central Europe, so they had plenty of cousins in Germany or Austria. A lot of Americans had come from Ireland too, so they hated the English because, well, Ireland back then was still under British rule. It was not independent yet. So many Irish Americans, and a lot of them, were rooting for Germany, not Britain. So with all that in mind, the US president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, maintained an isolationist stance. After the Lusitania incident in 1915, Wilson agreed to remain neutral if Germany backed off unrestricted submarine warfare. And when he ran for re-election in 1916, his slogan was, "He kept us out of war." Most Americans wanted peace, so this was enough to get him reelected. Now, I hate to break your bubble, but politicians occasionally lie. In the 1940 election, FDR also promised to stay out of World War II, and then he did the opposite in 1941. LBJ was the peace candidate in 1964, and a year later, he dramatically increased US involvement in Vietnam. Same thing with Bush in 2000, and then intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq shortly thereafter. So Wilson was reelected as a peace candidate in November 1916. He was inaugurated for his second term in March of 1917, and in April of that year, he went to Congress asking for a declaration of war. Oops. So what changed his mind? Well, early in the section, we discussed why the US gets involved overseas in general, and we boiled it down to three main categories. Profit is one, idealism, and then national security. And all three played a role in World War I. First, money. As mentioned earlier, the US was not 100% neutral in World War I. US companies sold plenty of weapons to France and Britain. Those two countries were broke by 1917, so they bought goods on credit, which meant that companies had a vested interest in making sure France and Britain won the war, otherwise they might default on their debt. So money, that was a factor. The British were also good at convincing the American public that the Germans were the bad guys. When attacking France in 1914, Germany had gone through Belgium, which was a neutral country, so that was a violation of the law of war right there. And then during the occupation of Belgium, Germany committed a number of atrocities against civilians, which were widely publicized by the British or even exaggerated altogether. So by 1917, a lot of Americans were referring to the Germans as the Huns, barbarians from Central Europe who were at war with civilized society. And you just need to Google Attila the Hun if you're not familiar with the historical reference. Also, in February of 1917, the Emperor of Russia, the Tsar, was overthrown and replaced by a centrist government led by Kerensky. That government was later overthrown by the communists in another revolution in October of 1917, but for a short period in the middle of 1917, Russia was a democracy. France was also a democracy, a republic. Italy and Britain were constitutional monarchies. And meanwhile, the Central Powers like Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans, they were all ruled by emperors. So by that point, the war was not just a war between random European countries. It looked, to Wilson at least, like a war between democracy and tyranny. So idealism played a role. The US wanted to defend democracies and also the suffering civilians of Belgium. Third, and finally, national security. In 1917, Germany hatched a plan to convince Mexico to attack the US. That was known as the Zimmermann telegram incident. The idea was to keep the US busy in North America so that the US would not have the time to join World War I. As it happened, the UK intercepted the Zimmermann telegram and then passed it on to the US government. Obviously, Woodrow Wilson and the American public were incensed when they learned that Germany was encouraging a neighbor of the US to attack the US. And those bumbling German diplomats were not even done yet. In 1917, Germany also announced that it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which they had put on hold after the Lusitania incident. And sure, that might convince the US to join World War I, but Germany figured that it would take a while for the US to train an army and send it to Europe, so Germany could win the war in Europe in the meantime. Also, they thought. So national security also played a role in the US decision to enter World War I. Germany was urging Mexico to attack the US and also attacking US merchant ships directly using those U-boats. So under the US Constitution, the president cannot declare a war on his own. The US Congress has that authority. So Wilson went to Congress in April 1917 to ask for a proper declaration of war. That document is in your workbook, and we'll discuss it together in our discussion. So I won't go into the details here, but let's just say that Woodrow Wilson said little about the financial interests of US banks that had loaned money to the Allies. That would have been too crass. He did mention national security, especially German submarines, but Wilson was an idealist, so he focused on the democracy issue. And here is the most famous passage of that declaration. Quote, "The world must be made safe for democracy. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind." Unquote. Wilson's idealism, that was also evident in another celebrated speech that he made when entering the war. And in that speech, he listed the 14 things that he hoped to achieve by entering World War I. So this is known as the 14-point speech. In the war, Francis wanted to get Alsace, Serbia wanted to get Bosnia, and so on. But Wilson insisted that, quote, what we demand in this war is nothing peculiar to ourselves, he said. What he wanted was, quote again, the world's peace. So not territory, but world peace. Making the world safe for democracy. I don't know if you've ever watched the Miss America contest, but typically there's a Q&A session when the candidates are asked what they want to promote as Miss America. And the answer is invariably world peace. So I want you to close your eyes and imagine Woodrow Wilson in a swimsuit with a sash that says Miss Virginia and who says, my goal is world peace. Now that's an image that would be hard to get out of your head. So how do you get to world peace? Well, Wilson had some ideas. First, he wanted open covenants of peace. And it was common before World War I for diplomats to sign secret treaties of alliances where they would agree to go to war under certain circumstances, the Triple Alliance, for example. Well, Wilson thought that this kind of secret diplomacy should end and that treaties should now be openly arrived at. This way, if diplomacy was done in the open, there would be a strong public pressure by the citizens who wanted to promote peace, not war. And Article 14 was similar. Wilson wanted to create what he called a General Association of Nations. And that would be a gathering place where diplomats from all countries could meet in the open and iron out their differences under the watchful eye of the public. And that became the League of Nations after World War I, and nowadays it's the ancestor to the United Nations in New York City. By the way, the idealistic tone of Wilson's agenda was widely shared at this time. We now refer to this conflict as World War I because we know that there was another, even more destructive conflict 20 years later, World War II. Well, people did not know that in 1917, so they called this conflict the Great War. Or they called it the war to end all wars because they thought that no one would be stupid enough to start another war after experiencing the horrors of trench warfare. Obviously, we have had quite a few wars since then because people don't take enough history classes and so they're bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. Study your history, for God's sake. That's the only way that we can learn from our mistakes in the past. Anyways, on to Article 2 of the 14 points, which was self-explanatory. Freedom of navigation is what Wilson wanted. So, no more submarine warfare. I want to note in passing that the US, which had been protected by tariff walls during the Gilded Age, was now starting to embrace the notion of free trade. That was a sign that American industry was becoming more competitive and confident on the world stage. And that remained a major goal of the US for the rest of the 20th century. Article 5 was the most far-reaching. It's kind of long and wordy, but basically Article 5 means self-determination. Let me explain what that means. Traditionally, borders had been set based on the law of the strong. So if Germany defeated France in a war, then Germany would take over the province of Alsace, whether the people there wanted to or not. And for Wilson, that process was undemocratic. People in Alsace were forced to join one country or the other against their will. And that was also dangerous because obviously France would fight another war to get Alsace back, as they did in World War I, and then Germany would do the same as they did in World War II, and then the process would never end. So self-determination, which is what Wilson advocated, would be based on a different principle altogether: the will of the people. Just ask the people of Alsace whether they want to be French or German or independent. It's a peaceful process involving a vote, not a war, and it solved the matter once and for all. Now, some of you might wonder, what about all the countries that Wilson had invaded in the Caribbean, like Haiti or the Dominican Republic? Shouldn't they have the right to self-determination? Is there a double standard there? What about the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba, which the US also occupied? There's a bit of a disconnect there. Well, I think Wilson simply had a double standard. He grew up in Virginia and South Carolina around the time of the Civil War, so he was a Class A racist. So for that reason, he thought that the people of Alsace and other European provinces, i.e. white people, could be trusted to make a choice about their future, hence self-determination. However, people in Haiti or Cuba who were of African or Hispanic or Native American descent, these were childlike and they needed some guidance, so no self-determination for them. So there were some limits to the idealism of Wilson. But keep all that in mind anyway, because the 14 points set the stage for much of US diplomacy in the 20th century. Free trade, open diplomacy, collective security, self determination. We will encounter the exact same ideas when we discuss, for example, the war goals of Franklin D. Roosevelt in World War II. So let's now move on to the war itself for the US. And initially, the impact was fairly limited. The US was a long way from the Western Front to begin with, and also the US basically had no army. I mean, sure, the US had a small army to contain Indians in the American West or invade small Caribbean islands, but that was it. The huge, permanently bloated military that's a feature of the modern federal government, that was not yet a thing. Coming out of the 19th century, the tradition was to have a very small military in peacetime and enlarge it as needed, but only when a war came. And we'll get back to that when we talk about Dwight D. Eisenhower and the military industrial complex. So when the US entered World War I in 1917, the US military was small and primitive, not ready at all to fight a major modern war on the Western Front against Germany. So the US had to institute a military draft because there was none before, train all these new recruits, equip them, and then ship all these people across the Atlantic to fight. And in practice, that took over a year. So the first experience that most Americans had of World War I was on the home front as civilians. And you may recall from the past section that in the early 20th century, the dominant political movement was progressivism in the US. Reformers like President Wilson believed that the federal government had a role to play in improving US society. In that sense, the war was a godsend. In wartime, people are willing to accept more taxes and more government meddling. So World War I allowed progressives to push their agenda further than ever before. Things like temperance, the prohibition of alcohol, that was passed during the war, that otherwise might not have been passed in peacetime. So World War I, in a way, was the apex of the progressive movement, but also the beginning of the end of that movement because the war was marked by government abuse. So eventually there was a public backlash against progressivism. One of the first casualties of war is usually freedom. And I'm referring here to the basic civil liberties that are guaranteed by the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, like freedom of speech, the First Amendment. In wartime, there's always a great desire by the government to limit what people can do and say, and a greater willingness by the Supreme Court to accept the curtailment of such liberties. Minorities are particularly vulnerable in that case. In World War I, that would mean German Americans. Many of them were recent immigrants who still spoke German at home, so many Americans looked at them as potential traitors to the country. And some of that abuse that they suffered from was pretty serious. Some German Americans were heckled in the street, abused, and in some cases lynched by the mob and killed. Some of the abuse, on the other hand, was more ridiculous. People renamed sauerkraut as liberty cabbage. Still pickled cabbage, but it's now a patriotic kind of pickled cabbage. And German measles also became liberty measles. Same symptoms, same disease, but a different patriotic name. All that may seem ridiculous to you because, well, it is, but I am old enough to remember that the run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003 led to similar abuse. Back then, the Bush administration put a lot of pressure on France to embrace the war in Iraq, which France refused to do, so there was a wave of Francophobia in Republican circles. I personally remember standing in line at a Burger King and the person in front of me ordered, quote, freedom fries, because, French fries would have been unpatriotic. Freedom toast was a saying, too, for a while. World War I also saw the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts in Congress. Espionage in that case means spying, and sedition means treason. So technically, the goal of these two laws was to root out traitors who were out to help Germany. In practice, though, the law was written very broadly, which is dangerous, and so the government was also allowed to prosecute anyone who dared to oppose the war effort in public and who criticized the President of the United States. Under the Acts, the Postal Service was also allowed to open the mail or to remove the special lower rates that magazines pay to make it more affordable to ship magazines. And that was indirectly a form of censorship. Magazines were afraid to criticize the war, otherwise the US Postal Service would, go postal, raise shipping rates as punishment, and the magazine would go under. So basic rights like freedom of speech and freedom of the press went by the wayside. So much for the First Amendment. The law was actually enforced. A famous case involved Eugene Victor Debs. I mentioned him before as a French-American member of the Socialist Party. He had run for president several times, earning as much as 5% of the vote in 1912, so very much left of center, but representing a significant sector of US public opinion. Think of him as like Bernie Sanders today or Alexandra Ocasio Cortez. So Eugene D. Debs opposed the war, which was his right to do as a US citizen under the First Amendment, but he was prosecuted anyway under the Espionage and Sedition Act and sent to jail, not for committing an actual crime, but simply for speaking out against the war and not agreeing with the president. And he remained in jail until he was freed by Warren Harding after the war. Earlier, I mentioned my experience during the Iraq War in 2003. That's not an isolated incident. That is a general rule about war and US democracy. When a war breaks out, dissenting voices and minorities are often victimized. If you go back all the way to the 1790s, the US back then was involved in some diplomatic tensions like the quasi war with France. So Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts as a result, which targeted recent immigrants from France in particular. You probably heard before how during World War II, the US sent Japanese Americans to internment camps, not because of the crime they had committed, but because they were seen as potential traitors based simply on the color of their skin. By the time we get to the Cold War in a future lecture, and that war was fought mostly against communist Russia, we'll see that Joseph McCarthy and others targeted left-leaning Americans. Again, certain political views were forbidden in wartime in the 1950s. After 9/11 in 2001, Congress also passed the Patriot Act. And just like the Espionage and Sedition Acts in World War I, this law allowed the government to spy on Americans. Look up which book you checked out at the library, or go through your texts and your emails that you sent on your phone. And suspected terrorists were also tortured and held in captivity for decades at Guantanamo without proper due process. So again, a restriction of civil liberties. I'll stop the list here because it's getting repetitive, but this is what you need to remember. When a war begins, people always get excited because they want to support the troops. And also, airplanes and tanks look cool on TV. But if you learn anything from today's lecture, it is that wars don't unfold as planned. They often last longer, and they cost more than anticipated, and they often result in government violations of civil liberties. So it's an important choice to make whether to join the war or not. Now, let's move to the actual fighting in World War I itself. As I mentioned earlier, it took a while for the US to train and ship an army to Europe. So in practice, the first US citizens to see actual combat were individuals who volunteered to serve in the French army on their own. They might be aviators who formed the famous Lafayette Escadrille, for example. And a lot of black Americans also fought in this way. The US Army was segregated by race until the end of World War II, so in practice, black Americans were restricted to menial tasks. Because the thinking back then was that black Americans somehow were not courageous or smart enough for combat roles or officer status. Well, the French army had no such agitation, in part, because France was short on troops after years and years of war. So the French army employed many soldiers of color, some of them from French colonies, and others from the US, black people who served under a French uniform. The official all-American army was led by General John J. Pershing, whose nickname was Black Jack Pershing. And just to be clear, he was white. He had been involved before in operations in northern Mexico against Pancho Villa, and then after that, he led the American Expeditionary Force in Europe in World War I. Most of those operations took place in northeastern France, in the Champagne region, and near the famous battle site of Verdun. Put the list of these battles on the PowerPoint slide. I'm not super interested in the particulars of military history, so I won't go into the details, but look all these battles up if you're a military buff. Belleauwood, for example. Either that or watch Sergeant York, which is another World War I flick about the US record in World War I. As a general rule, notice that all these battles that the US was involved in came rather late in the war. From the spring of 1918 forward, and the first few involved a limited number of US troops, so it was really in the fall of 1918 that the US military presence was really felt on the front line. And even then, something like 4 million Americans were mobilized in World War I, of whom something like 2 million actually made it to Europe in time, of whom about 1 million actually saw combat at the very end of the war, and of whom about 100,000 died, half of them in combat. I really don't want to minimize the US contribution to World War I because I'm a French and a US citizen, so I'm always proud that France and the US fought side by side in both world wars. But the US did join the war rather late and made a much smaller contribution in that conflict than France or Britain or Italy or Russia did. And that would limit the negotiating power of Wilson when the peace came in 1919. Which is a nice segue to our last slide, which is about just that, the peace settlement. World War I at first looked like it was going to go on forever, but it finally wrapped up in 1918. Germany was really suffering from the British naval blockade by then. France and England also had developed good tanks, which finally helped to break through the stalemate on the Western Front. And then American troops began to show up in large numbers by the fall of 1918 on the Western Front. So on November 11th of 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Germany agreed to a ceasefire, which incidentally is why we celebrate Veterans Day on 11/11 in the US. It is Armistice Day, the end of World War I. The cost of the war had been enormous. Economically, France and Britain were ruined, even though they won the war. The US made money, which was a big reason why the US would go on a path towards superpower status in the 20th century, replacing France and Britain. The human toll was great too, again, not for the US, but for other countries. All the major powers lost over 1 million deaths each, for a total cost of 9 million deaths. To make things worse, the end of the war was marked by a deadly pandemic known as the Great Influenza or the Spanish flu. The flu is a regular thing, we have it every year, but the strain that year was particularly nasty, so it killed way more people than usual, including young and healthy people, not just old and fragile people. So altogether, there were probably around 50 million people that died worldwide, which is to say even more than the war itself, which killed about 9 million people. Those of you who took my world history course know that I like to mention William McNeill's book Plagues and Peoples, which argues that disease had a more important impact in world history than politics or war. Things like the Black Death or the Columbian Exchange indeed killed way more people than Genghis Khan or Christopher Columbus ever did on the battlefield. But as historians, we always tend to focus on laws and battles and treaties, maybe because they're easier to study than viruses. And history is about human agency, how we humans have shaped our world. So it's always difficult for historians to acknowledge that germs can be more powerful than Napoleon, and yet they can. But anyway, the flu pandemic of 1918-1919 was very deadly, in part because of the war. It was first identified in US Army camps in Kansas, so obviously all the troop movements during the late part of the war, that helped spread the virus to Europe and the world. Wartime food shortages also made the virus very deadly in countries like Germany because, well, people were hungry. Part of the reason that historians have not paid much attention to the Great Flu epidemic of 1918-1919 is that, well, people at the time did not pay much attention either. So much was going on with the war that the epidemic seemed trivial by comparison. Also, governments were eager to minimize the extent of the epidemic so that the enemy would not feel emboldened by it, which is, by the way, the reason why we call it the Spanish flu. It wasn't specific to Spain, but Spain, as a neutral power, did not have wartime censorship, so the press covered the epidemic more extensively in that country, and that led to the mistaken belief elsewhere that the epidemic was somehow worse in Spain than elsewhere, which was mistaken. In other words, the epidemic was a reflection of the politics of the time. In the US, some cities ordered quarantines and shutdowns of super spreading locales like movie theaters, and they also imposed mask wearing. And then other cities refused to shut down and impose masks on political grounds. And there were even anti-masking leagues by people who refused to wear a mask in public. All that is intriguing, of course, when we look at it 100 years later, because I'm taping this in 2021 when we're going through another major pandemic, which has also become embroiled in partisan politics, including people who oppose masks and vaccine. And there's something reassuring about history. It's a way to realize that we as a people have gone through similar crises before and that we pulled through in the end. And there's something, in a way, depressing about history. No matter how much we learn about past mistakes, the percentage of idiots in a given society always seems to remain the same. But back to World War I. So the armistice of November 11th, 1918 was just that, a ceasefire. Diplomats then gathered in Paris in the spring of 1919 to discuss a permanent peace treaty. Those negotiations led to various peace treaties with the defeated nations, and they're all named after cities around Paris, the most famous one being the Versailles Treaty that was signed with Germany. The peace negotiations revealed a rift between all the allies. Woodrow Wilson, who traveled in person to Paris, was in favor of a more merciful peace. And remember his 14-point speech. The US sought no specific territorial or financial concession, and instead he was eager to secure a long-term peace, world peace. Also, the US had joined the war late, so he had suffered less in the conflict and was more willing to forgive Germany. By contrast, countries that had suffered far more from the war, like France, were insistent on obtaining major concessions from Germany and some amount of vengeance. And because those countries had contributed far more to the Allied victory, well, they shaped the final treaty more than Wilson ever did. So the Treaty of Versailles in the end took a bunch of land from Germany, so Alsace was retroceded to France, for example, and Germany also had to give up the bulk of its armed forces and all of its navy, and that made England happy. Germany also had to pay financial reparations for the cost of the war. This was an enormous sum, about $30 billion at a time when $1 billion, that was real money. Germany had to pay the sum in installments because they didn't have the cash, and that led to great financial instability in the 1920s, and that was a contributing factor to the Great Depression of the 1930s. We'll get to that when we discuss the crash of 1929. Critics also complained that those clauses would irk Germany so much that the country would seek revenge in the future. And unfortunately, they were true. Within 20 years, a World War I veteran named Adolf Hitler began World War II. So to avoid such future wars, Woodrow Wilson obtained the creation of the League of Nations as part of the Versailles Treaty, an international gathering place where diplomats would come and discuss their disagreements without resorting to war. His allies in France or Britain, they thought it was a stupid idea that would probably not work, but they figured, well, let's do it to make Wilson happy. Now, under the US Constitution, the executive branch is the one that negotiates treaties, i.e., the US president, but the US Senate, the legislative branch, is the one that needs to ratify those treaties by a two-thirds majority before the treaties can take effect. So after negotiating in Paris for 6 months, Wilson had to go back to the US and start all over again with US senators. And there he faced an uphill battle, especially since he suffered a stroke and was incapacitated for the end of his presidency. The US had traditionally been divided between two camps over foreign policy. You got interventionists like Wilson, who want to be involved with the outside world, make the world safe for democracy, for example. And then you have isolationists who are more inner-centered. They refuse to get involved in endless war overseas, entangled in Europe, except maybe in the immediate neighborhood of the US. And that ideological divide is often a sectional one. People from big cities of the East Coast, like Woodrow Wilson, they tend to be more interested in international affairs, while people from the middle part of the country, like, Idaho, they often embrace an America First policy. And the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, that was a high watermark for interventionism in US foreign policy. He oversaw a military expedition in northern Mexico, the invasion of Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, plus, as we just saw, a major war in Europe. But the isolationist party was not dead. When Wilson tried to get the Versailles Treaty ratified in the US Senate, isolationists like William Borah, a senator from Idaho, refused to get permanently involved in an institution like the League of Nations in Europe. And those isolationists were enough that Wilson failed to secure a two-thirds majority in the Senate for his treaty. So after spending all that time telling you what was in the Versailles Treaty, I must now tell you that the US was not a part of it. Other countries did ratify it, so the treaty took effect, but the US itself was not a part of the League of Nations, even though that was the brainchild of a US president. And not surprisingly, the League of Nations was not a successful institution, and it failed to prevent the outbreak of World War II. The failed ratification of the Versailles Treaty, that was a sign of isolationist backlash in the US. Americans were generally dissatisfied with the results of World War I. They had hoped to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, but in practice, the Versailles Treaty looked like a return to diplomacy as usual. And meanwhile, over 100,000 Americans had died in the war, and civil liberties had taken a hit. So don't be surprised if in our next section, when we get to 1920s and 30s, the country takes an isolationist turn and refuses to be involved in foreign affairs, until World War II, at least. Well, that's it for today. We've covered quite a bit today. So what should you learn from it if you're a young US citizen about to vote in your first election? Well, first, wars are a complicated thing that always unfold as planned and take a heavy toll in lives, treasure, and civil liberties. So in the case of World War I, it also helped with gender roles. So whether you're an isolationist or an interventionist, always think twice about whether to start a war. I'd say second, that the principles of the 14 points, they had a lasting impact in 20th century US foreign policy, especially the concept of self-determination. And I guess the third thing that we learned today is that people are idiots. Whether it's masks or vaccine or freedom fries, people seem to have a hard time accepting science or respecting minorities. I'll stop my rant there. Next time we'll start another section and we'll look at US society in the 1920s and 30s. So it will be time for flappers and Hoovervilles and Huey P. Long. Au revoir and goodbye.